Hi guys. Tonight I want to take you on a long and gentle journey through the life of one of the most fascinating and complicated figures in early American history, Alexander Hamilton. This will be a calm and soothing story, perfect for helping your mind settle as you drift off to sleep. You've probably heard his name, maybe from the Broadway musical or from a history class long ago. But tonight we're going to walk slowly through his entire life, from the earliest memories of his childhood to the final echoes of his legacy. You'll learn about the struggles, the ambition, the rivalries, and the heartbreaks. Each chapter, told in 24 soft-spoken parts, will unfold carefully and peacefully so that you can close your eyes and let your imagination do the wandering. So if you're ready, let's begin, slowly, gently, with part one. The ocean whispered against the rocks on the island of Nevis, a quiet little jewel in the Caribbean. In the mid-1700s, it was a place full of sunshine, sugar plantations and colonial ambitions, but also deep pain and quiet suffering. This is where Alexander Hamilton was born, sometime around January 11th, 1755, or perhaps 1757, depending on which records you choose to believe. Even in the beginning, his life resisted easy definition. There was always some blur, some mist around the facts. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was a woman of spirit and independence. She had been married before, unhappily, and fled her marriage, something scandalous for the time. Hamilton's father, James Hamilton, was a Scotsman who may have had charm, but lacked the resolve to keep a family secure. He abandoned them when Alexander was still just a boy. That meant Rachel was left to raise her two sons, Alexander and his older brother, James Jr., in difficult conditions. They were poor, very poor, and worse, in the strict, class-conscious eyes of the colonial world, they were illegitimate. The stain of being born out of wedlock would follow Alexander his whole life. But the boy had something even he didn't understand. He was precocious. His eyes always a little too sharp, his speech always a little too fast. He read anything he could find. He copied whole books by hand. He was curious about the world, about language, commerce, ships. He watched the busy port of Charlestown and studied the coming and going of goods, people, and news. When he was around 11, tragedy hit with a cold finality. His mother died of fever. They had been sick together, but only Alexander survived. In her small, simple home, surrounded by her few possessions and the books he loved, she breathed her last. He was left alone, technically orphaned, though his father still lived somewhere far away. But in reality, Alexander Hamilton was now on his own. People took pity on him. A cousin tried to care for the boys but died by suicide. The young Hamilton was taken in by friends, then apprenticed to a merchant firm, Beekman and Kruger, a trading business in St. Croix. It was there, in the world of ledgers, cargo manifests and correspondence, that Hamilton's mind bloomed. He showed such skill with numbers and negotiation that the owners trusted him to run the business when they were away. He was a teenager, barely more than a child, and he was signing contracts, balancing books, managing trade routes between the Caribbean and New England. Still, there was something restless in him. He was hungry, not just for food or shelter, but for knowledge, for movement, for purpose. He wrote long letters to friends describing hurricanes with poetic precision. One letter he wrote, after a massive storm, was so powerful and vivid that a local newspaper published it. People were amazed. They saw something in him that felt rare, something that made them think. This boy from nowhere, with no name and no money, might actually matter. A group of local benefactors, impressed by his intelligence and drive, decided to send him to North America to be educated. They collected money. They gave him a chance. And so, with the dreams of an island behind him and the vast unknown of a continent ahead, Alexander Hamilton boarded a ship in 1772 and set sail for New York. He arrived in a world on the verge of fire. The American colonies were growing restless under British rule. Taxes, trade restrictions, and a lack of representation stirred a storm of protest. But for the young Hamilton, the bustling city was a paradise of ideas. He enrolled at King's College, what we now call Columbia University, and buried himself in books. He studied law, philosophy, political theory. He argued. He wrote. His mind moved quickly, and so did his pen. Soon he found himself drawn into the ferment of revolution. He wrote pamphlets in defense of the colonial cause that were so articulate, so full of adult reasoning and fire, that people assumed they must have been written by someone twice his age. When it was revealed that the author was a teenage immigrant with no wealth and no family name, it only added to the mystique. Alexander Hamilton had arrived, but ideas weren't enough for him. When shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, Hamilton wanted to be part of it, not just in words, but in action. He joined a New York militia. He trained, drilled, and eventually became an artillery captain. And though he was young and small in stature, he impressed everyone with his courage, his discipline, and above all, his ability to lead. It wasn't long before someone noticed. That someone was General George Washington. Washington was looking for aides, young men who could write, organize, translate chaos into clarity. Hamilton became one of those aides, and then his most trusted one. For 4 years he was at Washington's side, writing letters, planning strategies, managing the flow of information in a war that often seemed unwinnable. But even in this prestigious role, Hamilton longed for battlefield glory. He chafed at being behind a desk. He wanted to command troops, to prove himself in combat. That hunger, that unrelenting drive was a defining feature of his life. So this is where we leave him tonight, a boy from a forgotten island, now a rising star in a revolution. He has no fortune, he has no noble blood, but he has a mind like fire and a heart that won't be still. Let your mind drift with him now, across the ocean and into the fog of war. Let his early story wrap around you like a warm blanket of history, quiet and steady. Close your eyes, and we'll continue next time from here. As dawn broke over the rugged encampments of the Continental Army, the cold air filled with the distant clatter of hooves and the crisp calls of morning duties, Alexander Hamilton sat bent over parchment, his quill scratching steadily, tirelessly. Though still in his early 20s, he had become the voice behind the general, the young, bright mind who captured the thoughts of George Washington with elegance and efficiency. He worked in candlelight and daylight, in tents and under trees, scribbling commands, appeals, and battle reports. He was Washington's right hand, but he was not content. For all the power of his pen, Alexander yearned for action. He longed for a command of his own, a regiment to lead, a field to conquer, a moment to write his name into the epic of American independence. And though Washington trusted him deeply, perhaps even loved him in his own way, he also hesitated. Hamilton's brilliance was too useful in administration, too vital in communication, to risk on the battlefield. But Hamilton was never one to wait quietly. Behind the lines, as the war dragged on, Hamilton's frustration simmered. He saw younger, less experienced men given commands, elevated for their family names or political connections. It rankled him. He believed in merit, in the promise that talent would be rewarded, regardless of birth. And so the tension built, quiet, polite, but unmistakable, between the ambitious aide and the cautious commander. There was an incident. One small, seemingly trivial moment in early 1781 that would alter the course of Hamilton's service. Washington called for him. Hamilton, perhaps late, perhaps distracted, did not answer right away. When he arrived, Washington, tired and under pressure, sharply rebuked him. Hamilton, proud and easily wounded, took offense. He resigned his post as Washington's aide-de-camp. It was a bold move, dangerous even, but for Hamilton it was necessary. He would not be chained to a desk forever. Still, the war was not yet over, and Hamilton was not yet finished. After months of persistence, he finally received what he had longed for, command of a light infantry battalion, and fate rewarded his tenacity. That summer, the war reached its crescendo in Yorktown, Virginia. British General Cornwallis had fortified the city, and the French-American forces moved to encircle him. In a coordinated assault, Hamilton was given a chance to lead a nighttime attack on Redoubt 10, one of the outer British defences. Under the cover of darkness, with bayonets fixed and hearts pounding, Hamilton and his men stormed the redoubt. The fighting was close, brutal, breathless, but they took it. They won. It was a victory carved into memory, and it became one of the crowning moments of Hamilton's military career. Yorktown would fall, Cornwallis would surrender, and the war, for all intents and purposes, would end. Hamilton had helped win a nation. But the war's end was only the beginning of his next life, the political one. Now a decorated officer, a scholar of law, and a close confidant of George Washington, Hamilton looked toward the fragile republic that was beginning to take shape. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at governing the United States, were weak and toothless. The country was a patchwork of jealous states, struggling with debt, distrust, and division. Hamilton saw the dangers of such a loose arrangement. He believed in a strong central government, one that could manage finances, regulate commerce, and provide stability. Without it, he feared the revolution would be wasted, that the nation would unravel. And so he returned to New York, where he completed his studies and became a lawyer. His mind, so sharp and quick, turned legal work into an art. He argued in court with elegance and fire. He was eloquent, forceful, persuasive, and always thinking ahead. He married Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of the wealthy and influential Schuyler family. It was a love match, full of warmth and loyalty, but it was also a powerful alliance. The Schuylers were one of New York's most prominent families, and through them, Hamilton gained entry into elite circles. Elizabeth, Eliza, was gentle where he was fierce, forgiving where he was proud. She believed in him, stood by him, even when storms gathered around them. She would become, in many ways, his anchor. Still, Hamilton remained restless. He wrote essays, gave speeches, argued policy. He made friends and enemies in equal measure. Among those enemies was a man who would become his lifelong rival, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was everything Hamilton was not. He was born to wealth and privilege. He moved with calm, genteel grace. Where Hamilton saw the need for a strong government, Jefferson feared tyranny. Where Hamilton believed in banks and industry, Jefferson championed farming and simplicity. Their visions of America clashed at the very core. But before that bitter rivalry took full shape, Hamilton joined forces with other visionaries, James Madison and John Jay among them, to craft a defense of the new Constitution. The document had been written in Philadelphia in 1787, and now it needed ratification. Many were skeptical. Many feared a powerful federal government. To answer those fears, Hamilton began writing a series of essays. Published under the pseudonym Publius, these writings became known as the Federalist Papers. They were eloquent, logical and passionate arguments for the Constitution, and Hamilton wrote more than half of them himself. His brain was tireless, pouring out complex legal and philosophical ideas with stunning clarity. He often worked late into the night, candles flickering low, as the streets of New York quieted outside. He would dictate to assistants or scratch his thoughts feverishly, page after page, outlining a vision of government that balanced liberty and order, freedom and structure. These essays would come to be studied for centuries, quoted by judges and scholars, admired for their insight. And when the Constitution was ratified, when the new government was formed, there was no question George Washington would be its first president. And Washington knew exactly who he wanted by his side. He asked Hamilton to become the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton accepted. He was young, just in his 30s. But he would now be responsible for the financial foundation of a new nation. And that's where we'll leave him for tonight. Standing at the dawn of America's next great challenge, with the weight of its future resting on his shoulders. Let your eyes rest now, and imagine the candlelight flickering over parchment, the whisper of papers, the quiet pulse of ambition in a world just waking to its future. Sleep peacefully, and we'll continue his story when you're ready. When Alexander Hamilton stepped into the role of Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, the United States was not much more than a fragile idea held together by hope and memory. The Revolutionary War had left the country deeply in debt, millions owed to foreign governments, soldiers, and private lenders. The states were like restless siblings, often squabbling more than cooperating, each with its own currency, tax systems, and conflicting priorities. Commerce was stalling. The credit of the new nation was in ruins. But Hamilton didn't see disorder. He saw opportunity. In this chaos, he glimpsed a chance to build something new, something stable and powerful, an economy that could match the ideals of the revolution with lasting strength. He believed that if the United States could harness its debts, unify its financial system, and build trust in its fiscal capacity, it could become not just independent, but formidable. From the very start, Hamilton moved with clarity and speed. His mind was like a sharp blade. cutting through confusion, balancing policy with practicality. His vision was bold. Assume all state debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, create a reliable tax system, and encourage manufacturing to diversify the young economy. He wanted the government to honor every dollar it owed, even at full value, so that trust could be built at home and abroad. This plan was not without its critics. Many, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, feared such centralization. They believed Hamilton was trying to create a government too powerful, too closely modelled after the British system they had just escaped. They accused him of favouring the wealthy, of consolidating power in a federal elite. But Hamilton pressed on. He submitted his famous Report on Public Credit to Congress in January 1790. It was a dense document, filled with numbers and logic, but it was also deeply philosophical. Hamilton argued that economic health was the foundation of liberty. If citizens couldn't trust their money, they couldn't trust their government. And if the government couldn't manage its finances, it would collapse under its own weight. To secure support for his plan, Hamilton made deals, most famously with Jefferson and Madison over a dinner in New York. In what would later be known as the dinner table bargain, Hamilton agreed to support moving the national capital from New York to a site along the Potomac River, what would become Washington, D.C., in exchange for Jefferson and Madison's support for his debt assumption plan. It was classic Hamilton. Compromise wrapped in strategy, always looking for ways to win the larger war, even if it meant losing a few battles. With that victory, Hamilton moved on to the next piece of his vision, the creation of the Bank of the United States. Modelled in part after the Bank of England, it would hold federal funds, issue stable currency, and help control inflation and debt. It was, again, a radical idea for the time. The Constitution did not explicitly grant the federal government the authority to create a bank, and Jefferson argued against it fiercely, claiming it was an overreach of federal power. But Hamilton countered with what would become one of his most important legal doctrines, the idea of implied powers. He argued that the Constitution gave the government the ability to do whatever was necessary and proper to carry out its duties, even if not spelled out word for word. The bank, he claimed, was necessary for collecting taxes, borrowing money, and regulating commerce. President Washington was uncertain. The debate between Hamilton and Jefferson raged in his cabinet. In the end, Washington sided with Hamilton. The bank was chartered in 1791. Hamilton's influence was now undeniable. His policies were shaping the country's very structure, how it handled money, how it regulated trade, how it would be viewed on the global stage. He introduced tariffs to protect American industry. He promoted the minting of stable coinage. He helped establish the Coast Guard to stop smuggling and enforce tariffs. Piece by piece, he laid the economic foundations of a functioning modern state. But all of this brilliance came at a cost. Hamilton's personality was fierce, relentless. He argued forcefully. He rarely compromised unless absolutely necessary. He made enemies quickly, and once made, they rarely ceased to oppose him. Jefferson loathed him. Madison, once a collaborator, grew distrustful and distant. In the newspapers, under pseudonyms, they attacked his character, his motives, and his ambitions. Hamilton responded in kind. He too used the press, writing scathing rebuttals, always defending his principles, often defending his pride. He believed his opponents were naive, their idealism dangerous. He saw in Jefferson a vision of agrarian simplicity that would leave America weak and vulnerable to foreign powers. Still, as the 1790s unfolded, Hamilton's star continued to rise, at least in terms of power. His economic program was reshaping the country. Cities grew, industry began to blossom, American credit improved dramatically. Foreign nations began to treat the United States as a serious entity, not just a rebel experiment. Yet the personal toll began to show. Hamilton worked endlessly, often at night, with little rest. He poured himself into every detail, consumed by the enormity of the task. At home, Eliza supported him quietly, lovingly, raising their children and keeping the household steady amid the whirlwind of his ambition. But Hamilton, though loyal in many ways, was also reckless. During this period, he made a mistake that would haunt him forever, a scandal that would later emerge from the shadows. He began an affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds. She was married, vulnerable, and sought his help. Hamilton, drawn perhaps by desire, perhaps by ego, gave in. Her husband, James Reynolds, discovered the affair and began blackmailing Hamilton, who, rather than expose his public position to scandal, chose to pay. The affair continued. The blackmail continued, and Hamilton, for all his brilliance, was caught in a web of secrecy and shame. He kept it hidden, for now. In public, he remained powerful. His policies, his speeches, his ideas, they defined the early Federalist movement. He became a co-founder of the Federalist Party, aligning with those who believed in a strong central government and a modern economy. But the years were turning. George Washington, wearied by politics and age, chose to step down after 2 terms. In his farewell address, written largely with Hamilton's help, he warned against factionalism, foreign entanglements, and the dangers of political division. And as Washington departed, the stage was set for new conflicts. John Adams, the vice president, would become the second president. And Hamilton, though not officially part of Adams' administration, remained a force behind the scenes, advising, influencing, and sometimes undermining. He was not done, not by a long shot. But the winds were changing. Tonight, let your mind drift back to those early years of the Republic, where cities were still forming, where newspapers echoed with argument, and where one man's mind sought to stitch a nation together, one policy at a time. Sleep deeply now, and we'll return soon to see how ambition and power would test even the brightest star. By the time the year 1797 arrived, Alexander Hamilton was no longer a member of George Washington's cabinet, but his influence still pulsed beneath the surface of American politics like an undercurrent. Though he had resigned as Secretary of the Treasury in 1795, worn down by constant attacks, needing time with his family and hoping to restore some personal balance, he was far from retired. He remained the architect of America's economic system, the intellectual lodestar of the Federalist Party, and a man both revered and feared. But storms were gathering. The presidency had passed from Washington to John Adams, a Federalist like Hamilton, but a very different kind of man, earnest, irritable, and fiercely independent. Adams believed in the Federalist cause, but he did not trust Hamilton, whom he saw as overreaching, manipulative, and hungry for control. Hamilton, for his part, viewed Adams as emotionally volatile and unsuited to lead. Though no longer in office, Hamilton acted as if he still held the reins of power. He sent letters of advice, sometimes demands. He tried to shape appointments, policy, even foreign affairs. Adams grew increasingly wary of his former colleague and resented Hamilton's shadow over the administration. It was during these years that a rift, once papered over by shared ideology, began to widen into a chasm. Internationally, the young United States found itself caught in a rising storm. France, once a revolutionary ally, was now at odds with America. The French Revolution had spiraled into chaos, and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte shifted Europe into further instability. American ships were being seized by the French, and diplomatic relations unraveled. It was a dangerous moment, a crisis of identity and survival for the new republic. President Adams, seeking to avoid war, sent envoys to France in what became known as the XYZ affair. But the mission ended in humiliation, with French agents demanding bribes just to begin negotiations. Outrage swept through America. Federalists, Hamilton chief among them, called for a military build-up and potential war. Though Adams authorized the creation of a provisional army, he was cautious about actually going to war. Hamilton, however, saw opportunity. He lobbied aggressively for a strong military response, even maneuvering to become the de facto commander of the new army under George Washington, who had agreed to come out of retirement in name only, on the condition that Hamilton be his second in command. With Washington aging and infirm, Hamilton in practice held the reins of the army. He began reorganizing its structure, appointing officers, preparing for a war that never came. He had uniforms designed, battle plans drafted, fortifications reviewed. He believed France might invade. He believed a strong military was necessary. And perhaps deep down he saw this moment as his chance for lasting glory, leading troops not just with a pen, but with a sword. But Adams resisted. Against Hamilton's fervent urging, he chose peace. In 1800, he reopened diplomatic channels and eventually secured a treaty with France, diffusing the crisis. It was a remarkable act of restraint, and one that enraged Hamilton. He believed Adams had weakened the nation's position. He believed the president had squandered a critical opportunity. And so, in one of the most dramatic miscalculations of his career, Hamilton acted. He wrote a pamphlet, a long, scathing public letter, attacking Adams's character, judgment, and fitness for office. Though Hamilton's intent was to sway Federalist opinion away from Adams and toward another candidate, the effect was disastrous. The pamphlet was leaked to the public. Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party, gleefully circulated it. Federalists were horrified. The party fractured. And Adams, wounded and furious, would never forgive the betrayal. The election of 1800 became one of the most contentious in American history. Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied in the Electoral College, throwing the final decision to the House of Representatives. For days, ballots were cast and recast. Uncertainty gripped the nation. It was a moment that tested the very bones of the Constitution. And then, unexpectedly, Hamilton intervened. Despite his deep and often vicious opposition to Jefferson, Hamilton believed Burr was worse, an opportunist with no guiding principle. He saw Jefferson, for all their bitter disagreements, as a man of philosophy, of ideas. Burr, in Hamilton's view, was a chameleon, motivated only by personal gain. Hamilton lobbied Federalist congressmen to support Jefferson. His influence helped swing the vote. And so Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. Aaron Burr became vice president. Hamilton had once again shaped the outcome of a nation's fate. But he had also earned a new enemy, one who would wait in the shadows. In the meantime, Hamilton retreated slightly from national politics. He returned to his law practice in New York, where he continued to write, advise, and participate in public life. He was still a figure of power, but he was also a man increasingly burdened by regrets and losses. In 1801, tragedy struck with a force he could not deflect. His son, Philip Hamilton, only 19 years old, had inherited his father's pride and fire. When another young man insulted Alexander's honor in print, Philip challenged him to a duel, hoping to defend the family name. He followed the code of conduct his father had once advised, aiming to throw away his shot. But the other boy did not. Philip was struck and mortally wounded. He died days later in the arms of his mother, his brilliant future extinguished. Hamilton was devastated. The loss hollowed him. Eliza, heartbroken but strong, turned even more deeply to her faith. They walked together in grief, quiet and changed. From that point on, Hamilton's public life dimmed. He still wrote. He still debated, but the fire that had once consumed everything began to burn lower, deeper. He focused more on family, on reflection, on mentoring young men with promise. But the past never truly sleeps. Aaron Burr, now vice president, was watching, waiting. And Hamilton, still sharp, still outspoken, continued to speak against him. The road that would lead to their fatal encounter was already beginning to take shape. But for tonight, let us pause here. Let your breath slow as you imagine the candlelight fading in the Hamilton home, the silence of grief, the echo of dreams deferred, a brilliant son gone, a father searching for solace, a nation evolving around a man whose own world had begun to crack. Sleep now, and we'll return to him again when the world begins to move once more. In the gentle hush of early dawn, as the Hudson River flowed quietly past the city of New York, Alexander Hamilton would sometimes walk alone, his thoughts heavy, his pace slow. The death of his son Philip had left behind a silence no speeches or letters could fill. He had once believed so fiercely in the power of intellect, of ambition, of upward movement through determination. But in the quiet aftermath of tragedy, those beliefs felt dimmer, more fragile. The cost of honor, it seemed, could be unbearably steep. Eliza had withdrawn into her faith. She prayed, she read scripture, she held their remaining children close. And Hamilton, once a man who needed the roar of politics and the burn of argument, turned inward. He wrote less, he walked more. He spent time with his family. He tried for a while to live a quieter life. But quiet was not his nature. In the early 1800s, New York City was changing. It pulsed with commerce, immigrants, and industry. Hamilton, ever the builder, remained fascinated by growth, by institutions, by the shaping of systems that could outlast the people who designed them. Even after stepping back from national politics, he advised banks, helped develop legal precedents, and still participated in local debates. He believed in structure. in order drawn from chaos, and he kept trying to apply that belief in whatever way he could to the young American experiment. Yet beneath the surface, a slow-burning enmity was reaching its boiling point. Aaron Burr, a man Hamilton could neither ignore nor trust. A man whose ambition, in Hamilton's eyes, was corrosive, self-serving, and dangerous. Their rivalry had simmered for years, marked by icy correspondence, political maneuvering, and veiled insults. Burr had become vice president in 1800 only because of a fluke, a tie in the Electoral College that gave him as many votes as Jefferson. But instead of stepping aside, as was expected, Burr had fought for the presidency in the House vote. That act had branded him, in Hamilton's mind, as a man willing to upend the Republic for personal gain. Hamilton had helped block Burr's ascension then, and Burr had not forgotten. In the years that followed, their paths continued to cross, often in matters of influence and position. Burr ran for governor of New York in 1804, seeking to revive his political standing. Once again, Hamilton stood in his way. He did not campaign publicly, but in private letters and conversations, he spoke of Burr as a man without principle, a man who should never be trusted with power. One of those letters found its way into the public eye. It was published in a newspaper. In it, Hamilton was quoted as expressing a still more despicable opinion of Burr than he had ever previously put into writing. The quote was vague, but its tone was unmistakable. Burr read it, and something in him hardened. He wrote to Hamilton, demanding an explanation. Did he stand by those words? Would he apologize? Hamilton, careful and precise, responded by neither confirming nor denying. He refused to retract, citing the vagueness of the accusation. He defended his honor while sidestepping the challenge. But Burr would not be placated. For him, this was not merely a matter of insult. It was a final insult, in a long string of humiliations. He challenged Hamilton to a duel. It was 1804. The practice of dueling was frowned upon, technically illegal in New York, but still conducted under codes of honor by those who felt reputation outweighed risk. Men of their class, their background and their pride, especially men like Burr and Hamilton, believed that some slights could only be answered with pistols at dawn. Hamilton was torn. He had already lost one son to a duel. He hated the violence, the finality. He had denounced the practice in public, written against it, even counseled others to avoid it. Yet now he faced the same choice. Refusing could mark him as a coward. Accepting could mean death. He wrote letters to Eliza, to friends, preparing them for the possibility he might not return. In one note, he confessed his intent to throw away his fire, to aim away, to waste his shot, an act of moral resistance, perhaps, or a final attempt to avoid taking another life. But he still accepted the challenge. He would go. On the morning of July 11, 1804, the two men met in Weehawken, New Jersey, across the river from Manhattan. It was a quiet, shaded ledge above the water, familiar to Hamilton. It was where his son had died just 3 years before. They stood 10 paces apart. Their seconds arranged the terms. Time slowed. Hamilton raised his pistol. He fired first, his shot flying into the branches above Burr's head. Burr, after a breathless moment, returned fire. Hamilton staggered. The bullet had struck him in the lower abdomen, smashing through organs, fracturing his spine. He collapsed. There was no second shot. He was rushed back across the Hudson to New York, barely conscious, bleeding internally. Eliza was sent for. She arrived at his side, heartbreaking, as the man she loved, the father of her children, the restless, brilliant force who had built so much, lay dying. Hamilton lingered for over 24 hours. He drifted in and out of lucidity, speaking softly, requesting comfort. Friends visited, clergymen prayed. At last, surrounded by family, he slipped away on the afternoon of July 12, 1804. He was 47 years old, and just like that, the most electric mind of the founding generation was gone. Aaron Burr survived the duel, but his reputation did not. He was charged with murder, though never prosecuted. His political career was over. He wandered in disgrace, his name forever shadowed by the echo of that morning shot. For Eliza, life after Hamilton became a different kind of mission. She wore black for the rest of her life. She preserved his letters. She interviewed veterans, colleagues and friends. She worked to safeguard his legacy, to ensure that his name would not fade. She helped found orphanages and educational institutions, turning grief into generosity. And though Hamilton had died with enemies, he had also died with purpose. He had left behind a treasury, a coast guard, a banking system, a body of legal writing, and one of the most profound political texts in American history. His fingerprints were all over the framework of the nation. Tonight, let your mind return to that quiet riverbank, the stillness of morning, the weight of history settling over 2 men, 2 pistols, and a century waiting to be shaped. Rest now, knowing we will soon explore what came after, the legacy that time could not erase. The years that followed Alexander Hamilton's death moved like slow tides across the young American nation, carrying with them both the memory of the man and the quiet erosion of his reputation. In the immediate aftermath, Hamilton's name lingered in a haze of controversy. He had died in a duel, an act seen by many as outdated, foolish, and needlessly tragic. His opponents had already painted him as power-hungry, elitist, dangerously monarchical. Without him to speak, to write, to defend himself, their voices often won the air. But not forever. In the quiet corners of New York, in drawing rooms and schools, in the minds of those who had known him best, Hamilton's memory continued to stir. And at the center of this quiet resurrection was a woman who had once been his home, Eliza Hamilton. Left a widow at just 47, Eliza found herself the steward of a legacy that was both monumental and misunderstood. She had lost her son and then her husband to the same senseless tradition of dueling, and yet her faith had not faltered. She believed that Alexander's work, his writings, his ideas, his sacrifices, mattered, and she would spend the next 50 years of her life making sure others believed it too. Eliza could have withdrawn into mourning. Many expected her to, but instead she rose with an extraordinary grace and quiet determination. She wore her sorrow like armor and turned her focus outward, to service, to memory, to preservation. One of her first acts was to protect and gather her husband's writings. She reached out to his colleagues, secretaries, fellow soldiers, anyone who had worked with him. She collected letters, essays, transcripts, speeches. She carefully stored his correspondence, especially those he had written to her, though she burned many of her own letters, perhaps out of modesty, perhaps to protect what had passed privately between them. Still, what remained would later help historians rebuild the arc of his life. But Eliza didn't only look backward. She looked at the world around her and sought to shape it into something kinder. In 1806, she co-founded the first private orphanage in New York City, the New York Orphan Asylum Society, guided by the belief that no child should be left without support or shelter, as Alexander had been on Nevis. She served as its director for decades, visiting often, offering guidance, ensuring the children had education and care. Her life became an extraordinary blend of public mission and private remembrance. She lived modestly, depending on the generosity of family and friends to sustain her household. Her finances were often stretched thin. Hamilton had left behind debts as well as honor, but she never once complained. She seemed to carry his memory not as a burden, but as a light she was determined to keep alive. The Hamilton children, meanwhile, began to carve their own paths. Philip, their firstborn, had died tragically, but 7 others survived into adulthood. Eliza ensured they were educated, supported, and encouraged. One son, James Alexander Hamilton, would become a lawyer and even serve briefly as acting Secretary of State under President Andrew Jackson. Another, John Church Hamilton, took up the task of compiling and publishing his father's collected works, part of the long, slow rehabilitation of Alexander's image in the public eye. Time has a strange way of reshaping reputations. In the decades following Hamilton's death, the political winds shifted. The Federalist Party withered and faded, replaced by Jacksonian Democrats and emerging factions. For a time, Hamilton's ideas were seen as relics, too centralized, too aristocratic. But the more the nation grew, its economy expanding, its banks stabilizing, its legal institutions maturing, the more clear it became that many of the systems Hamilton had envisioned were not just functioning, but thriving. And slowly, respect returned. By the mid-19th century, historians began to take a fresh look at Hamilton's role in the founding. His influence on the Constitution, his role in creating the Treasury, his defense of a strong union, all were re-evaluated with growing admiration. The Federalist Papers, long read by scholars and jurists, gained new attention as cornerstones of American political thought. Eliza lived to see some of this. She lived to see portraits hung, articles written, and tributes offered. She lived to see the early chapters of her husband's redemption begin to take root in public memory. And through it all, she remained the quiet, unwavering advocate of the man she had loved. She moved to Washington, D.C. in her later years to live with her daughter and son-in-law. There, in the nation's capital, built in part upon compromises her husband had helped forge, she continued to tell his story to anyone who would listen. She met with presidents, congressmen, and young scholars. She spoke not just of his achievements, but of his spirit, his tireless energy, his belief in the American dream, his loyalty, even his flaws. She died in 1854 at the age of 97. By then, the country was on the brink of civil war, a test of union that Hamilton had warned might come. But his name was stronger now, his memory more secure. The seeds Eliza had planted had begun to grow, and even as the world around her changed, from horse-drawn carriages to railroads, from a handful of states to a sprawling nation, she remained tethered to the man she had once watched rise from obscurity to power, fall from grace, and rise again in the hearts of those who understood what he had built. Hamilton's grave in the Trinity Churchyard of Lower Manhattan became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Nearby lies Eliza, at his side, as she always promised to be. And so, in the quiet hours of night, if you were to walk among those stones, you might feel it, the hum of memory, the whisper of paper, the faint echo of a man who believed that a penniless orphan could build a country from ideas, from words, from vision. Let yourself rest with that image now. A woman in black, steady in purpose, a legacy kept alive not by fame, but by love. And when you close your eyes, know that the story doesn't end here. The story of Alexander Hamilton was never just his own. It was America's story too, and it was only just beginning to unfold. The world that Alexander Hamilton left behind continued to grow in ways even he, with all his foresight and restless imagination, might never have fully anticipated. America, still young, still raw, stepped forward into the 19th century like a child learning to walk, sometimes with confidence, often with hesitation, but always forward. In the decades that followed his death, the ideas Hamilton had fought for were slowly reabsorbed into the bloodstream of the nation. His vision for a strong central government, a stable banking system, and a vibrant industrialized economy, once controversial, now began to feel foundational. The debates that had once consumed the early republic began to shift into the background as new challenges emerged. Westward expansion, industrial revolution, slavery, and the slow, turbulent reckoning with the promise of liberty for all. Still, Hamilton's fingerprints were everywhere. When canals were dug, when factories rose, when stock exchanges buzzed with life, one could almost hear the echo of Hamilton's reports on manufactures. He had written, years before it became popular, that America must diversify beyond agriculture, that its strength would lie in its ability to produce, to trade, to grow economically in complexity as well as scale. And though his contemporaries had often resisted these ideas, Jefferson chief among them, the tide of history moved ever closer to Hamilton's blueprint. His Federalist Papers, meanwhile, took on a life of their own. What had once been political arguments became legal scripture. Judges, legislators, and constitutional scholars began to study them not just for historical insight, but as tools for interpretation. Through those pages, Hamilton's voice returned, logical, passionate, precise, helping to guide future generations through the maze of constitutional law. Yet even as his ideas endured, his personal legacy remained complicated. In popular imagination, Hamilton's name faded for a time. The duel with Burr, sensational, tragic, eclipsed many of his achievements. He became, for some, a cautionary tale rather than a hero, brilliant, ambitious, but undone by pride. For others, especially those in legal and economic circles, he was revered, but quietly as a thinker more than a figurehead. It was not until the later 19th century that Hamilton's legacy began to rise in the public's eyes again. As the Civil War loomed and questions of federal versus state power returned with brutal urgency, Americans once again turned to the Founding Fathers for guidance. Lincoln, among others, read the Federalist Papers closely. In a time of national fracture, Hamilton's arguments for union, strength, and a cohesive identity seemed more relevant than ever. His image began to reappear in public monuments, paintings, and literature. In 1870, his portrait graced US currency, an enduring symbol of his role as the architect of the American financial system. And when the US Treasury decided, decades later, to permanently enshrine him on the $10 bill, it felt almost poetic. His enemies had once tried to erase him from the narrative. But now, his face would live in the hands and wallets of millions. Still, Hamilton's story wasn't simply being reclaimed by the nation at large, it was also being told patiently and lovingly by his own family. John Church Hamilton, his son, dedicated much of his life to restoring and documenting his father's legacy. He published 7 volumes of collected writings, painstakingly edited, curated and annotated. It was a work of devotion, as much as of scholarship. He wanted the world to see the man not just as a politician, but as a philosopher of nationhood, a father, a visionary. Other descendants would follow suit, working behind the scenes to preserve letters, artifacts and memories. The Hamilton legacy passed quietly from generation to generation, not shouted from rooftops, but whispered in libraries, classrooms and courtrooms. And through it all, the silence around Eliza's work remained. For more than a century, her role was overshadowed, almost forgotten. Yet without her tireless decades of preservation, her insistence that the world remember, the man might have been buried not just in stone, but in time. Eliza's life had been one of devotion, not only to her children, not only to the nation, but to an ideal. That truth mattered. That sacrifice deserved remembrance. That history was not something to be left to chance. As the 20th century dawned, America stood transformed. Railroads stretched from ocean to ocean, cities had risen like steel forests, and war loomed on a global scale. The Founding Fathers became less immediate in the public mind, more like statues than people. Hamilton's story for a time felt sealed in textbooks, removed from emotion, reduced to bullet points, Treasury Secretary killed in a duel, Federalist. But beneath that surface, something deeper remained. There was always something about Hamilton that drew the curious, the ambitious, the misunderstood. He had come from nothing. He had written his way into history. He had dared to believe that merit could rise above station, that thought could rival birthright, that the pen could be mightier than the sword, though in the end it was the sword that claimed him. He was a contradiction. Proud but insecure, disciplined but passionate, brilliant but reckless. And in that complexity, he remained deeply human. Historians began to rediscover him, not as a side note, but as a central figure. They wrote biographies, taught courses, and re-examined the old letters with fresh eyes. And gradually, a new portrait of Hamilton began to emerge, not as Jefferson's foil or Burr's victim, but as one of the principal architects of American identity. He was, in many ways, the modern founder, the one who imagined America not as a pastoral ideal, but as a living machine, powered by commerce, ambition, diversity, and structure. As night drapes over these reflections, imagine Hamilton not as a statue in marble or a name in print, but as a young man again, quill in hand, gaze fixed ahead, mind racing through the possibilities of a future no one else could yet see. Let yourself drift now through the slow pulse of centuries, through ink and silence, through memory held by those who refused to let it vanish. And know that in the next part of our journey the world will shift again, and Hamilton's story, like all great stories, will find new breath in a most unexpected way. The 20th century crept in with all the noise of modernity, telephones buzzing, automobiles rattling over cobbled streets, factories humming like metallic beasts. The American experiment, once fragile and theoretical, was now a sprawling, undeniable force in the world. And yet in all this movement, the memory of Alexander Hamilton rested quietly. Respected in legal circles, remembered in currency, nodded to in textbooks, but largely absent from the hearts of everyday people. He had never been the romantic figure. Washington was the father, Jefferson the philosopher, Lincoln the savior. Hamilton? He was the architect, the one buried beneath structure, beneath policy. He didn't lend himself easily to myth. He hadn't been a president. He hadn't died in war. He had died instead in a duel, with a political rival over pride. And yet the deeper truths of his life, his vision, his origin, his complexity, waited patiently, like pages in a closed book. In academic circles, Hamilton's ideas remained relevant. Economists studied his banking systems, legal scholars unpacked his constitutional interpretations, political theorists debated his vision of federalism. His voice echoed in courtrooms and lecture halls. But for the public, his story remained muted. Important, yes, but distant. He was a figure on a bill, a name on a street, a statue in a park. That began to change in the mid-20th century. In 1957, historian Richard Brookhiser was born, the man who would later become one of Hamilton's most influential modern biographers. In his early career, Brookhiser began to look past the traditional founding myths and into the lesser-known stories. And in Hamilton, he found something unique, a man whose energy still crackled off the page. He wrote of Hamilton not as a relic, but as a modern mind trapped in an 18th century world. His work helped reframe Hamilton not just as the Treasury Secretary, but as a thinker whose time had come again. Others followed. Ron Chernow, a journalist turned biographer, devoted years to researching and writing Alexander Hamilton, published in 2004. It was an extraordinary volume, sweeping, humane, rich with letters and context. Chernow peeled away the marble to show the flesh and blood. He showed the immigrant boy with nothing but words, the ambitious aide with a mind too sharp for his own good, the family man, the flawed man, the nation builder. The biography was a critical success. Readers were drawn into Hamilton's drama, into the tension between his ideals and his wounds, between what he built and what he broke. For the first time in a long time, Hamilton's life felt immediate again, real. And in that same world, quietly, an artist was listening. Lin-Manuel Miranda first picked up Chernow's biography on a vacation. He was already known for his musical In the Heights, but as he read Hamilton's story, something clicked. He saw the rhythm in the writing, the urgency in the rise, the fire in the fall. Hamilton's life, Miranda realized, was a kind of verse. His letters were lyrics, his speeches, refrains, his rivalries, duets. He began writing, slowly, carefully, rhythmically. And in 2009, at the White House, Miranda performed an early version of what would become the opening number of Hamilton, an American musical. It began with a simple question: how does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman? And from the moment it was spoken, the air shifted. Laughter turned to awe. The audience, including the Obamas, watched as the past came alive, not with powdered wigs and solemn narration, but with rhyme, rhythm, and raw humanity. This was not Hamilton, the statue. This was Hamilton, the heartbeat. Years of writing, composing, revising followed. The musical premiered off-Broadway in 2015. Then it moved to Broadway, and then suddenly, irrevocably, it became a phenomenon. Hamilton was unlike anything the American stage had ever seen. It cast actors of color in the roles of the Founding Fathers. It used hip R&B and traditional Broadway styles to tell the story of the Revolution and its aftermath. It captured the energy, diversity and tension of America, then and now. Audiences were stunned. Critics raved. Students who had never heard of the Federalist Papers were now quoting them. Ticket lines stretched for blocks. The soundtrack played in dorm rooms, in classrooms, in cars. Hamilton's words, his actual words, were sung by millions. The musical reminded the world that history wasn't dead, that the founders were not just carved into marble, but were once angry, passionate, complicated human beings. And no one embodied that truth more than Alexander Hamilton. Suddenly, children dressed as him for Halloween. Students debated his economic policies in high school halls. Libraries saw a surge in Hamilton-related checkouts. The $10 bill, once just another piece of currency, now felt like a tribute. And yet, through the musical's bright lights, something quieter happened too. People returned to the source material. They read his letters. They learned about Eliza. They found the old words, the ones he wrote by candlelight by the battlefield in grief and triumph, and discovered that they still spoke, still mattered. The musical did not invent Hamilton's greatness. It revealed it. It lifted the veil history had drawn and reminded the world that one man, born into obscurity, writing his way out of poverty, building systems from thin air, defending principles even to his own ruin, was worth remembering, not just as a founder, but as a human being. And through it all, Eliza's voice, now given a song of her own, rose again. The widow who kept his name, who told his story, who built schools and visited orphans, stepped out of the shadows. Her devotion became legend, her grief a monument. Tonight, let your mind drift through a theatre bathed in blue light, the echo of a pen scratching across parchment, the pulse of drums rising from the orchestra pit. Feel the way history loops back on itself, not as a circle, but as a song that never quite ends. And sleep now, knowing that the next part of the story, the final part perhaps, is not about how Hamilton lived or died, but about how we remember him, about what we choose to carry forward, and what we choose to sing. There's something haunting about memory, how it lingers in stone and ink, in whispered stories, in melodies carried from stage to screen. In the case of Alexander Hamilton, memory was once fragile, tucked into fading letters and forgotten footnotes. But now, in this new century, it lives again, restored not only in books or on Broadway, but in the pulse of public imagination. Yet fame in the modern world is a fickle thing. A stage spotlight burns bright but fast. And though Hamilton, an American musical, brought a storm of recognition, lifting his name into millions of conversations across the globe, the deeper legacy of the man, what he built, what he feared, what he hoped, requires a quieter kind of attention. To understand that legacy, you must return not to the duel, nor the dazzling theatre, but to the scaffolding beneath the Republic itself. Hamilton's belief in a strong central government, once a point of bitter division, became a cornerstone of American endurance. In times of national crisis, economic collapse, civil war, global conflict, it was Hamilton's systems that allowed the country to respond, to recover, to remain united. His insistence on federal control of finance, taxation and credit wasn't just theory, it was architecture, and it worked. When the United States created the Federal Reserve in 1913, it was built on ideas Hamilton had championed a century earlier. A national financial institution with centralized oversight, able to manage currency, lending, and economic stability. Hamilton's vision had always been ahead of its time, and now time was catching up. His role in shaping constitutional interpretation also deepened. As judicial review evolved, as cases reached the Supreme Court, his writings, especially those in the Federalist Papers, were cited again and again. Federalist number 78, where Hamilton argues for an independent judiciary and the power of courts to strike down unconstitutional laws, became foundational. Generations of justices read his words not as historical documents, but as active living principles. In the classroom, Hamilton became more than a footnote. He became a debate. Professors challenged students to grapple with his contradictions. A man who defended strong government but distrusted populism, who fought for liberty yet supported policies that favored elite institutions, who championed upward mobility yet participated in structures that excluded many. He was, like so many figures of his era, shaped by limitations and privileges. He owned slaves, or at the very least engaged in transactions that benefited from slavery. He opposed slavery intellectually, yet never fully separated himself from the system that sustained it. These complexities, once glossed over, are now examined with care, not to cancel or dismiss, but to understand, to see the whole man, not just the marble bust. Eliza's legacy, too, began to shine more brightly. Once overlooked in history's spotlight, she emerged as a symbol of grace and resilience. Historians began to explore her role not just as Hamilton's widow, but as a figure in her own right, founder, reformer, advocate. Her orphanage, what became Graham Windham, continues to this day, more than 2 centuries after she first opened its doors. Her decision to preserve Alexander's writings, to protect his name through decades of financial strain and political neglect, now seems nothing short of heroic. Without her, we might have only fragments. Because of her, we have volumes. And in this present era, when the future feels as uncertain as it did in Hamilton's own time, his life offers something more than historical curiosity. It offers perspective. He was a man who believed in systems over slogans. He trusted data, structure, and disciplined governance. He thought deeply about debt, trade, foreign policy, and defense. He understood that freedom without order could become chaos, and that order without freedom could become tyranny. And he walked that razor's edge, trying to find the balance. Perhaps that's why he still resonates. In a world full of noise, his voice, clear, urgent, uncompromising, cuts through. He reminds us that ideas matter, that principles, even flawed ones, can shape destinies, that writing isn't just communication, it's construction. And beneath all of that, he remains a story. A boy on an island, born out of wedlock, reading by candlelight, a clerk counting barrels in a shop, A soldier riding through snow with orders in his coat, a husband holding his dying son's hand, a man rising before dawn to settle a score he would not survive. His story is not just about founding a country, it's about becoming someone. It's about what can happen when a mind is set loose against the world, unafraid, uninvited, unstoppable. Tonight, let your mind follow him one more time, walking beneath trees in early morning, the city slowly waking around him, his coat drawn tight, his gloves worn, a letter folded in his pocket, a final thought unfinished. He disappears into the mist, but his story remains. And as you drift into sleep, carried by the rhythm of his journey, remember, Hamilton's legacy was not written in stone, it was written in ink. And ink, when protected, can last forever. In the stillness of libraries and the echoing halls of universities, Hamilton's ideas continue to stir minds. They sit quietly on the pages of law books and political science syllabi, but if you listen closely, if you read slowly, you can still hear the beat of urgency, the rhythm of a man who wrote like his life depended on it. Because in truth, it often did. Part of the enduring fascination with Hamilton lies in his unrelenting pace. He did not glide through life. He sprinted. And that sprint was not just ambition. It was fear, it was trauma, it was the sharp edge of memory chasing him. A childhood spent in uncertainty left him with no illusions about security. For Hamilton, the world could fall apart at any moment. So he worked as though time was a storm behind him. He wrote like he was outrunning the void. And yet, for all his brilliance, for all the towering structures of policy and argument he built, Hamilton never quite managed to build a place for himself in the warm centre of political consensus. He was always at the edge of parties, of favour, of understanding. Too radical for conservatives, too authoritarian for liberals, too practical for the dreamers, too idealistic for the pragmatists. He was in many ways America's first outsider-insider. When you trace the lineage of American political thought, Hamilton appears not just as a founder, but as a prototype for a certain kind of public figure, the policy intellectual. The man with a plan. The one who doesn't just shout slogans, but drafts frameworks, balances budgets, calculates trajectories. He didn't wait for problems to present themselves. He anticipated them, prepared for them, designed systems to prevent them. And it was this obsession with infrastructure, financial, legal, institutional, that set him apart. He didn't want to tear down government. He wanted to perfect it. This vision wasn't always popular. In fact, much of Hamilton's career was spent defending his work against those who accused him of betraying the revolution's democratic spirit. To Jefferson and his followers, Hamilton's belief in centralized authority felt like a return to monarchy, a betrayal of the populist ideal. But Hamilton never saw it that way. To him, order wasn't tyranny, it was security. And security was what allowed liberty to flourish. He believed that the government had to be strong enough to withstand the winds of chaos, economic panic, and factionalism. He saw what happened when nations lacked that strength. He had seen it in the Caribbean, in the collapse of colonies, in the lawlessness of revolution. And so he tried to build guardrails. But the very strength of his convictions often became his weakness. He argued too hard. He refused to bend. He alienated allies. Even as he helped shape the executive branch, the judiciary, the economy, and the national defense, he made enemies in every direction. Yet he never stopped. He once wrote more than 50 essays for the Federalist Papers in just 6 months, many overnight, fueled by coffee, conviction, and the weight of the future pressing against his pen. He never treated these essays as abstract theory. They were blueprints for survival. He was, even then, trying to prevent the disintegration of what he and others had barely just created. That's perhaps what makes Hamilton such a modern figure. His understanding that nations are not held together by tradition or bloodlines, but by frameworks and agreements, by systems. And when those systems crack, when they are neglected or undermined, the whole structure risks collapse. Hamilton knew that fragility. He felt it in his bones. In the present day, as democracies face growing tensions around the globe, as questions of federal power, economic inequality, and constitutional law resurface in new forms, Hamilton's words find new relevance. They aren't relics, they're warnings. And also, blueprints still worth consulting. Yet beyond policy, beyond institutions, there is another reason Hamilton lingers in the imagination. He wrote himself into being. Long before the Federalist Papers, before his work in the Treasury or his wartime service, Hamilton wrote letters that described hurricanes and heartbreak, letters that asked for help, that told stories, that invented a future out of ash and ink. These letters, written when he was just a teenager, were so striking in their voice, their imagery, their sense of scale, that people around him took notice. They didn't just hear desperation. They heard talent, and they responded. They raised money. They sent him north. They gave him a chance. Hamilton's life was proof that narrative could be a kind of currency, that to be seen, to be remembered, to have a voice, sometimes you needed only one thing, the ability to write your way into someone else's imagination. And he never stopped doing that. Even when writing policy memos, even when drafting economic reports, even when arguing before Congress or in the press, Hamilton understood the power of language. He knew that if you could make someone feel the logic, if you could make them hear the rhythm in your reasoning, you could change the course of a nation. He didn't just wield facts, he performed them. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine him again, not in a cabinet room, not on the battlefield, not in a duel, but at a desk. A candle flickering, the sound of a quill on paper, the streets of New York quiet outside. And in that silence, one man writing to be understood. Writing to matter, writing always because it was the only way he knew to hold the world together. The room is small, the night is long, and the words are everything. In the still night hours, when even the city's restless noise had dulled into hushed breaths and distant hooves on cobblestone, Alexander Hamilton often found himself alone with his thoughts. Thoughts that surged like waves against the fragile shoreline of peace he so rarely touched. He was a man who couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop planning, couldn't stop remembering. And among those memories, there were some that never softened, no matter how many nights passed. One of them was the memory of George Washington. For all the complexity of Hamilton's career, all the brilliance and controversy, his relationship with Washington remained one of the deepest and most defining elements of his life. It was a bond forged in war, tempered in politics, and layered with admiration, tension, and mutual dependence. To Hamilton, Washington was more than a mentor. He was a pillar, a constant, a rare example of power restrained by character. They had met when Hamilton was still young, still an artillery officer with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. Washington, then Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, recognized something in Hamilton. An intensity, a clarity, a fire that reminded him of the kind of men needed not only to win wars, but to build the future. He invited Hamilton into his inner circle, made him an aide-de-camp, and from that moment on, Hamilton became the pen behind the general. For 4 years, they worked side by side. Hamilton wrote letters, crafted orders, handled diplomacy, and translated the vast disarray of war into actionable clarity. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't battlefield glory, but it was vital. And though Hamilton longed to lead troops to win fame in combat, he understood the value of being at the nerve center. Still, the relationship was not always smooth. Hamilton could be impulsive, proud. He bristled under Washington's command at times, feeling stifled, underused. There were disagreements. There was even a temporary rupture, a moment when Hamilton, angered by a perceived slight, resigned from his position. But Washington, ever pragmatic, brought him back when the time came to lead men at Yorktown. And when Hamilton charged the redoubt with sword in hand and emerged a hero, it wasn't just a victory for the war. It was a validation, finally, of his worth as more than a strategist. Their connection endured beyond the battlefield. When Washington became president, it was Hamilton he called upon to craft the nation's economic foundation. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton's influence grew to levels that rivaled even the president himself. And though others, Jefferson, Madison, warned of Hamilton's ambition, Washington trusted him. Again and again, he backed him, sided with him, defended his decisions even when politically risky. In fact, much of Washington's presidency was shaped by Hamilton's intellect, his policies, his words. Washington's farewell address, often cited as one of the most enduring political documents in American history, was largely drafted by Hamilton. And in it we see not only Washington's voice, but Hamilton's philosophy. A warning against factionalism, against entangling alliances, and against the erosion of unity. When Washington retired from public life, Hamilton felt the ground shift. He had lost his greatest patron, his shield. And when Washington died in 1799, Hamilton was inconsolable. He mourned deeply, not just for the man, but for what the man represented. Stability, decency, discipline, a kind of leadership Hamilton feared the country might never see again. He wore mourning clothes, he wrote eulogies, he cried in public. And when he founded the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternal organization for Revolutionary War officers, he helped ensure Washington's memory would be preserved, not as a statue, but as a brother in arms. Hamilton once wrote, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen," words that would forever attach themselves to Washington's legacy. But they also revealed Hamilton's own heart. Because for all his own battles, for all his own genius, he knew there was something rare about Washington, something he both admired and could never quite emulate. Hamilton's life, by contrast, was always closer to fire. He burned through time. He consumed his hours, his health, his relationships, all in the pursuit of achievement and legacy. Washington moved with gravity. Hamilton moved with velocity. And in the quiet after Washington's passing, Hamilton began to sense that he too would not last long. Perhaps that was why he began writing more feverishly than ever, why he began organizing his papers, why he returned to the law with such purpose, mentoring younger men, trying to pass on something enduring, why he sometimes walked alone near Trinity Church, staring at the small patch of earth where one day he knew he would be laid to rest. He was preparing, not for death, but for memory. He had no illusions that the world would automatically remember him kindly. He knew his enemies were many and powerful. He knew his faults had left marks. But he also knew that his work, the systems, the writings, the blueprints, would outlast him if someone took the time to protect them. And so he turned, as he always had, to words. He wrote essays, defenses, clarifications. He drafted documents to protect his wife and children. He wrote, too, in private, reflections on mortality, on faith, on the weight of conscience. He seemed, in those final years, to be trying to write his own eulogy in pieces. And when he walked the streets of New York in those days, grey coat trailing behind him, hat pulled low, it was not as the nation's hero. It was as a man increasingly aware that the country was moving on, that the centre he had helped build was now pulling away from him. Still, he did not slow. He never learned how. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let the softness of silence surround you, picture them both, Hamilton and Washington, standing once more beneath a flag they helped raise, watching a city rise around them, uncertain of the future, but confident in what they had given it. Two men, one vision, carried into a century they would never see. And in the quiet between history and sleep, know that some stories remain because someone kept writing. And Hamilton, above all, kept writing. As the seasons turned across the early American Republic, the young nation continued to unfold, sometimes in promise, sometimes in turmoil, but always in movement. And though Alexander Hamilton had been gone for years, his influence lingered in the fabric of that growth. It was in the way banks operated, in the legal arguments made before judges, in the balance between state and federal power that shaped nearly every national debate. Yet despite all that he had built, the man himself often remained obscured, his name wrapped in controversy, his motives misunderstood, his voice fading into the background noise of newer generations. Still, he had not vanished completely. In the drawing rooms of New York and Philadelphia, in the minds of scholars and lawyers, Hamilton's ideas remained alive. Sometimes whispered, sometimes argued, but never entirely forgotten. And yet the question lingered. Who truly knew him? Not just the public figure. Not the pamphleteer, the soldier, or the secretary, but the man behind the defences. The one who, at the end of every long day, returned home not to battle strategy or financial reports, but to family, to Eliza. In the aftermath of his death, Eliza Hamilton carried more than grief. She carried the task of protecting the truth. She had to answer questions from strangers. She had to shield her children from the uglier corners of public opinion. And she had to live, each day, in the shadow of a love that had been taken from her too soon. Their marriage had not been perfect. Few are. There was the betrayal of the Reynolds affair, a wound that left her devastated and humiliated. It wasn't only the act, it was the public confession. Hamilton had written the infamous Reynolds pamphlet in an effort to clear his name of financial corruption, admitting to adultery to prove he had not misused public funds. But in doing so, he had exposed his private life to the world and shattered Eliza's heart. For a time she withdrew, burned many of their letters, closed herself off from him. And yet she came back. Not out of weakness, but out of something deeper, an unshakable sense of commitment, a belief in forgiveness, a belief perhaps that the totality of a person could not be defined by their worst mistake. She returned to his side, and when he fell, when the duel took him, she stood at the center of his legacy, fiercely protective, quietly resilient. She had always been that way, though few had noticed. In the early years of their marriage, when Hamilton was consumed by work, by politics, by war, it was Eliza who anchored the household. She raised their children with warmth and discipline. She handled the finances, organized the household affairs, and kept the world from slipping into chaos when his attention was elsewhere. She was, in many ways, the stillness to his storm. After his death, she did not remarry. Instead, she turned her life towards service. She founded the orphanage, continued her charity work, and spent the next half-century ensuring that Alexander's memory would not disappear into scandal or neglect. She interviewed those who had served with him, recorded their accounts, and preserved the documents they offered. She worked tirelessly with her sons, particularly John Church Hamilton, to collect, edit, and eventually publish Alexander's writings. She could not bring him back, but she could make sure the world saw him whole. The process was slow, painful, often thankless. There were no statues of her, no applause, but Eliza worked because she believed that the truth mattered, not only the good, not only the bad, but the whole. And in doing so, she taught the nation something Hamilton himself never quite managed to express. That legacy is not simply what one builds, but what one leaves in the hearts of those who remain. Her love had not been blind. She had seen his brilliance and his flaws, his generosity and his ambition, his tenderness and his temper. She had lived through both the soaring highs of his career and the deepest lows of his personal missteps. And yet, through it all, she chose to love him. It is easy to celebrate heroes. It is harder to understand them. Harder still to hold on to their memory when time begins to wear it thin. But Eliza did. And as the years passed, and the republic he helped create weathered civil war and industrialization, expansion and upheaval, her quiet labor bore fruit. The name Hamilton endured. Not simply because of the musicality of his ideas, but because someone believed his story was worth saving. It is said that memory can be an act of resistance, an act of love. If so, then Eliza Hamilton's life was both. In the end, she lived longer than almost every founding father. She watched the world change, watched trains replace horses, watched telegraphs replace letters, watched presidents come and go, some of whom had once been boys under her roof. And through it all, she remained a gentle sentinel of the past. When she passed away at 97, she left behind more than a name. She left behind proof that devotion can outlast despair, that truth can survive distortion, and that even in the quietest rooms, history is being written by those who choose to remember. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine her sitting by a window in Washington, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, papers spread before her. Outside, the city hums and grows. Inside, she turns one more page, her fingers tracing his handwriting, her heart steady. She is not mourning anymore, she is remembering, and she will not forget. In the gentle haze of the 19th century, long after the last cannon fire of the Revolution had echoed into silence, a new America was rising. A nation of steel and smoke, of railroads cutting across mountains, of factories breathing soot into sky. The world that Alexander Hamilton had once imagined in ink and debate was taking physical form now, brick by brick, ledger by ledger. And in this world, his presence, though no longer loud, remained unmistakable. It was in the banks that now dotted the cities, their columns tall and solemn, their vaults echoing the very structure he once proposed in his reports. It was in the whirring of cotton mills and the pulse of commerce, moving fast through iron rails and winding riverboats. This was not Jefferson's pastoral dream of gentle farms and quiet towns. This was Hamilton's America, messy, industrious, bustling, urgent, even if his name was rarely spoken. And yet every now and then, Someone would stumble upon his writings, an essay buried in the Federalist Papers, a policy memo from the Treasury years, a speech brimming with fire. And when they read it, truly read it, they would feel it, the hum of a mind always 5 steps ahead. One of those readers was Chief Justice John Marshall. Though Hamilton had died before Marshall reached the height of his influence on the Supreme Court, their philosophies intertwined. Both believed in the power of federal government. Both feared fragmentation and instability. And under Marshall's leadership, the court upheld many principles that Hamilton had once outlined in pen and parchment. It was as though the two men, though separated by death, were still working in concert. One from the bench, one from beyond. Marshall's landmark decision in McCulloch v. Maryland, which upheld the constitutionality of the National Bank, echoed Hamilton's arguments almost word for word. The idea that the Constitution granted implied powers, powers not explicitly written but essential to governance, was a Hamiltonian doctrine, now enshrined in law. And as America pushed westward, growing more complex by the year, it leaned again and again on those systems Hamilton had put in place. The Federal Mint, the Coast Guard, the funding of public debt, the architecture of economic policy. Still, the man himself remained a ghost to many, too complicated to lionize, too important to ignore. In paintings he was captured with a stern expression, hair pulled back, eyes fixed forward. But those paintings could never quite convey the ferocity of his intellect, nor the vulnerability he carried in quiet moments. The scars from his childhood, the loss, the poverty, the shame, had never fully faded. They were stitched into his worldview, informing everything from his economic theories to his personal pride. He believed that no person should be trapped by birth. He believed that talent, not title, should rise. And yet, he also feared democracy untethered from discipline. He saw how mobs could be swayed, how emotions could undermine reason, how demagogues could manipulate fear. It made him a paradox, a champion of meritocracy who distrusted the masses, a radical thinker with conservative caution. It was this tension that made him hard to categorize. And so, for much of the 1800s, Hamilton remained caught between reverence and suspicion. Jeffersonians painted him as an aristocrat in disguise. Jacksonians barely mentioned him at all. And yet he kept surfacing, like a submerged stone in a fast river, always underfoot. Writers, too, began to take interest. In essays and biographies, in speeches and poems, his name would occasionally reappear. Not with the glory of Washington or the mystique of Jefferson, but with something sharper, something more unsettling. He was remembered as the realist, the builder, the man who saw the country not as it was, but as it could be, flawed, striving, unsteady, but capable of greatness through structure and will. And always, quietly, his family watched this unfolding from the margins. His sons grew older, had children of their own. The Hamilton name, once shouted in newspapers, now rested quietly on law firm doors, on university rosters, on deeds and documents tucked away in attic trunks. Eliza, until the end, never stopped telling the story. Even as her eyesight dimmed and her steps slowed, she would speak of him, her Alexander, with reverence and candor. She did not hide his failures. She did not exaggerate his virtues. But she believed with unshakable clarity that he had tried to build something lasting. She believed that his heart had been, in the end, faithful. And so she guarded that legacy with quiet fire. As the Civil War approached, dividing the nation in ways Hamilton had feared might one day come, many began to revisit the founders, not as myth, but as mirror. Who were these men who had stitched a country together from rebellion and argument? What could they teach a fractured land about endurance? Hamilton's writings, full of warnings about disunion, about the dangers of faction and unchecked localism, took on new urgency. His insistence on federal strength, once criticized, now seemed prescient. His fears of fragmentation, once dismissed, were now playing out in headlines and bloodshed. And so, piece by piece, America began to remember. Not with parades or monuments, those would come later, but with questions, with curiosity, with a recognition that perhaps the loudest voices in history are not always the most remembered. Sometimes it is the quiet builders, the ones who write, who structure, who organize, who shape the world most deeply. Tonight, as sleep gently begins to tug at your thoughts, imagine Hamilton's America, not the one he lived in, but the one he imagined. A place of movement, of trade, of cities rising from marsh and stone, A country ruled not by aristocrats or mobs, but by law, by vision, by minds willing to work when others slept. He did not live to see it all, but he saw enough to believe it was possible. And now, as the night settles around you, let the hum of his unfinished dream carry you forward, one quiet heartbeat at a time. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows a life lived at relentless speed. After Alexander Hamilton's death, that silence was deafening, not because the world had stopped, far from it, but because something had been removed from the noise. A certain sharpness, a certain rhythm. A mind that had once filled every political chamber with motion had gone still. And yet, history has a way of catching up to those who ran ahead of it. By the time the Civil War ignited in the 1860s, Hamilton's long-dormant warnings had begun to glow like coals beneath ash. He had spoken of it in theory, this tension between state and federal power, this fear that too much decentralization would tear the country apart. And now the fault lines had become battle lines. The South had seceded, the Union was crumbling, and the fragile fabric of the Republic was being tested in blood. The irony was sharp. A nation born in revolution now found itself fighting to preserve the very union it had once rebelled to create. In this crucible, Hamilton's ideas began to resurface. President Abraham Lincoln, himself a student of constitutional theory, turned to the Federalist Papers often. He understood what Hamilton had meant when he warned that liberty without structure was vulnerability, that government must be more than aspiration. It must be a machine built to withstand storm and strain. The Union, Lincoln believed, was not merely a compact of convenience. It was a perpetual bond, a national identity, not just a geographic arrangement. This was Hamilton's language, not the soaring poetry of Jefferson, but the steel framework of law and order. The belief that for a republic to endure, it must be able to govern, not just inspire. As the war raged, as brother fought brother and cities burned, it became clear that Hamilton had not only envisioned a country of commerce and credit, but of resilience. His systems, federal taxation, national banking, centralized military command, now became lifelines. The very infrastructure he had fought for gave the North an advantage not of passion, but of logistics. Wars are not won by ideals alone. They are won by supply chains, by railroads, by currency, by law. And Hamilton had foreseen that. Still, he was not canonized. Not yet. The war ended. The Union held. Slavery was abolished. A new chapter began. But in the jubilant aftermath, as monuments rose to Lincoln, Grant and others, Hamilton's memory remained complicated. His reputation still wore the shroud of controversy. The duel, the affair, the elitism some accused him of. He had been too hard to love in his own time, and too complex to resurrect in full. But the tide was turning. As Reconstruction gave way to the Gilded Age, as the American economy exploded in industry and innovation, historians and thinkers began to trace the lines backward, to ask who had predicted this, who had argued that America would not remain a rural patchwork, but would become a global force, who had written about factories, tariffs, patents and manufacturing when the soil still outnumbered the smoke. The answer was clear: Hamilton. And so the scholars returned. They began to reprint his works, to study his policies, to treat his vision not as a footnote, but as a forecast. In universities, students began to read the Federalist Papers not only for what they said about the 18th century, but for what they revealed about enduring tensions between freedom and order, localism and nationalism, fear and ambition. Meanwhile, his face had already been quietly circulating in wallets and tills across the country. In 1861, just as the war was breaking out, the first national paper currency was issued. Among the early bills was one bearing the image of Alexander Hamilton. It was more than symbolic. It was a recognition, subtle but profound, that the man who had designed the nation's financial architecture deserved to appear on the very instruments of that system. As decades passed, the portrait evolved, but the presence remained. By 1928, the modern $10 bill was introduced, and Hamilton's image was fixed permanently in the public eye. For generations to come, schoolchildren, shopkeepers, and citizens would handle his face without always knowing his name. But he was there, always, quietly, watching. Yet symbols alone do not preserve memory. Stories do, and Hamilton's story, still tangled in complexity, required careful telling. That work fell again to his descendants, and to a few key historians. John Church Hamilton, his son, published multiple volumes of his father's writings in the mid-1800s. But it would be others later who brought clarity to his contradictions, who dared to show Hamilton not as a marble figure, but as a man. Men like Henry Cabot Lodge, who edited his collected works, men like Richard Brookhiser, who found in Hamilton a founder for the modern age. And women too, biographers, scholars, archivists, who combed through brittle letters, deciphered fading ink, and reconstructed a life not through legend, but through labour. Each generation found a different Hamilton. To some, he was the immigrant who rose from nothing. To others, the ambitious schemer undone by pride. To others still, the architect of a nation too vast for the soil it stood on. And in a way, all were true, because Hamilton never offered a simple shape. He was always lines crossing lines, a contradiction embodied, a storm of brilliance barely held in place by reason. He was the past, but also, somehow, the future. And tonight, as the air grows still and your thoughts slow into quiet drift, picture a city, any city, lit by lamps, humming with energy, people moving beneath high towers, commerce flowing, words written and exchanged at the speed of light. That was his dream, not the silence he left behind, but the noise he helped to create, controlled, balanced, elevated. Sleep now and hear that noise as music, the music of systems, of structure, of a nation that still, in some ways, hums with his rhythm. There is a moment in every long story when the echoes begin to feel louder than the voice that made them. When the person becomes a presence, the man becomes a memory, and yet that memory begins to move again, finding new shapes, new rhythms, new listeners. For Alexander Hamilton, that moment arrived slowly, like the tide returning not with a crash, but with a whisper. The 20th century had advanced far beyond anything Hamilton could have imagined. The machines of war had become monstrous. The global economy had expanded into something vast and volatile. The American presidency, once a new and uncertain office, had become the most powerful post on the planet. But for all the changes, Hamilton's ideas had not rusted. In fact, in many ways, they had only sharpened. When the stock market crashed in 1929, sending the world into the Great Depression, economists and policymakers turned back toward the questions Hamilton had once asked. What is the government's role in stabilizing markets? How should debt be handled? What responsibilities does the federal system have when states or banks collapse? During the Roosevelt administration, as the New Deal reshaped the contours of American economic life, some hailed Hamilton as a spiritual predecessor. While Roosevelt's methods were undeniably progressive, the principle of federal intervention to preserve national stability had roots in Hamiltonian logic. He had long believed that government must do more than exist. It must act, it must build, and when necessary it must protect its people, not just with muskets but with markets. That belief echoed into the very bones of the 20th century's economic architecture. As the Cold War began, and capitalism found itself locked in an ideological battle against communism, Hamilton's vision of a powerful federal system with a dynamic, regulated economy became a model for American resilience. He had, in essence, created not only the foundations of US finance, but the language with which the country would defend itself, economically, politically, and diplomatically, for generations. Yet still, in school books and public conversations, his name remained quiet. Students memorized his titles: First Secretary of the Treasury, author of the Federalist Papers, founder of the National Bank. But the man himself, the orphan, the immigrant, the restless genius, was too large for a textbook, too intricate for a test. He lived instead in fragments: a quote, a paragraph, a brief note in the margins of American history. But he had always been more than a list of accomplishments. And slowly that truth began to dawn again. In the mid-20th century, the idea of Hamilton as a distinctly modern founder began to take hold. Unlike Jefferson, whose agrarian ideal faded in an industrializing world, Hamilton had written about manufacturing, patents, immigration, credit, and central planning, all at a time when America was still mostly farms and frontier. To look at a modern city, alive with commerce, contracts, courts, and constant motion, was in a way to look at Hamilton's dream realized. He had imagined America not as a frozen pastoral scene, but as a living organism of ambition and advancement. That vision, for better or worse, had won. And still there was something more, something harder to define. It was in the way Hamilton's life refused to become neat. He had always defied containment. Born outside the bounds of legitimacy, he shattered every category people tried to place around him. Immigrant but proudly American, poor but elite by intellect. A man of order who died in chaos. A believer in structure who loved passionately, fought recklessly, and wrote like a man always outrunning time. That complexity became in the end his most modern trait. The 20th century was full of neat narratives, heroes and villains, allies and enemies. But as the century wore on, people began to crave truth over myth. They wanted texture, flaws, humanity. And in Hamilton, they found it. Biographers took another look. Not to cleanse his sins, but to understand them. Not to elevate him to sainthood, but to return him to sight. They explored the affair, not to excuse it, but to trace the loneliness and self-sabotage beneath it. They examined his policies, not just in celebration, but in critique, asking hard questions about elitism, class and control. They re-examined his role in slavery, in race, in gender, and refused to flatten him into perfection. And somehow that made him feel more alive, more real. And perhaps that is why, when a new century arrived, and with it a generation shaped by identity, complexity and narrative, Hamilton found new breath. A musical was on the horizon, but before that, something deeper had happened. The story had returned, the one Eliza had tried to save, the one Hamilton had tried to write with every ounce of ink he had left. It was waiting for a world complicated enough to see him. Waiting for a moment when a founder didn't need to be flawless to be worthy. Waiting for someone to say, what if we told it again? But this time through the lens of rhythm, of voice, of contradiction. And as the final decades of the 20th century gave way to the 21st, that question was asked, not just by historians but by artists, by storytellers, by children of immigrants, by those who had felt outside the narrative but now saw a path back in. Hamilton, the man who had written his way out of nothing, was once again becoming a story. And soon the world would hear it. But for now, rest with the quiet hum of that return, a city of lights beyond your window, a name forgotten, now stirring, the whisper of pages turning in the dark. He is not gone. He is still being written. In the first soft breaths of the 21st century, as the world spun faster beneath satellite skies and silicon networks, the shape of memory itself began to change. History no longer lived solely in books or bronze statues. It pulsed through screens, moved in algorithms, and flowed like electricity through culture. And it was here, in this new current, that Alexander Hamilton stirred once more. The name, long confined to classrooms and currency, started to whisper again in places no one expected. Not in courtrooms or lecture halls, but in theatres, living rooms, earbuds and street corners. Not just in English-lit essays, but in playlists, memes and spoken word. This rebirth was not orchestrated by a committee or a museum. It began with a single voice, asking a question wrapped in rhythm. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman? When Lin-Manuel Miranda stepped onto the stage of the White House in 2009 and performed those opening lines, a hush fell over the room. A hush not of confusion, but of awakening. It was as though something locked away had been unearthed. The cadence, the breathlessness, the urgency. It wasn't just entertainment. It was recognition. Miranda had read Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton and had seen in it not just a founding father, but a revolutionary soul. A man of words, born without status, who had clawed his way into the heart of power through language, wit, and defiance. A man whose story was not only American in its ambition, but modern in its messiness. Over the next 6 years, Miranda would build Hamilton, an American musical, piece by piece, writing songs on subway rides, developing characters from dusty letters, weaving historical fact into verse and harmony. He saw the old battles of Hamilton's life not as relics, but as rhythms. The debates over federalism, race, power, identity, they weren't gone. They were still echoing, still unresolved. And in 2015, when Hamilton opened at the Public Theatre, then moved to Broadway, the world listened. Audiences arrived expecting a historical musical. They left having witnessed something closer to resurrection. Because Hamilton didn't just tell the story, it felt like the story. The syncopation of rap mirrored the velocity of Hamilton's mind. The duets and harmonies captured the alliances, betrayals and heartbreaks with raw immediacy. And perhaps most transformative of all, the cast, black, brown, diverse, refused the traditional mold of powdered wigs and portraits. They looked like America, present-day America, and they made the story feel like it belonged to everyone. For the first time, a founding father felt human. Not because he was idolized, but because he was revealed. Flawed, obsessive, brilliant, reckless, idealistic. A man who loved fiercely and made terrible mistakes. A man who never stopped writing, even when writing cost him everything. A man who believed, more than anything, in legacy, not in being remembered for glory, but for impact. Hamilton became more than a musical. It became a movement. Schoolchildren sang about cabinet meetings, politicians quoted lyrics in speeches, critics praised its genius. And audiences, night after night, left the theatre not just entertained, but charged. Challenged to think about who gets to tell a story, who gets remembered, whose voices are heard. And through it all, Hamilton's own words danced in and out of the score. I'm not throwing away my shot. History has its eyes on you. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? The questions he asked with his life were now being asked by millions. But there was something else, quieter, softer, that the musical did. It gave voice back to Eliza, in a single moment at the show's end as she steps forward and gasps as the lights soften and the music fades. Eliza tells her husband's story one last time. She raises an orphanage, she preserves his letters, she lives on. And in doing so, she reclaims what history so often forgets. The witness, the keeper, the one who remains when the storm has passed. That gasp, small, tender, mysterious, became one of the most talked about moments in theatre. Some saw it as revelation, others sorrow. Some thought it was Eliza seeing the audience, others thought it was Eliza seeing Alexander again. But all agreed it was breath. Breath after silence, breath after decades, breath that said, I am here, I remember, I still believe. And so in that final scene, the stage became a kind of time machine. Not to take us back to 1776, but to collapse the distance between past and present. To remind us that the men and women who shaped the world were not gods, they were people. And that their choices, their words, their letters, still echo. In the years after Hamilton took over the world, the interest in Alexander's life deepened. His birthplace in Nevis became a destination for curious travellers. His home in Harlem, the Grange, welcomed more visitors than ever. Scholars, podcasters, teachers, and students reopened the archives. Debates resumed, not just about what Hamilton had done, but about what it meant. Was he a hero? A warning? Both? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe Hamilton's gift wasn't perfection. Maybe it was motion. He moved, constantly, toward knowledge, toward nationhood, toward legacy. And maybe that's why we still feel him. Because the story never settles. It keeps pulsing forward, asking new generations to decide what to carry, what to challenge, and what to remember. Tonight, as you drift once more into sleep, let that rhythm carry you. Not the rhythm of fame or victory or even tragedy, but the quiet, persistent rhythm of a man writing in the dark. One more page, one more sentence, one more shot. Because some stories, even after centuries, are still being written. As the years passed beyond the phenomenon of Hamilton, an American musical, the ripple of renewed attention around Alexander Hamilton deepened into something steadier, more introspective. No longer just a figure reimagined in song, he became a gateway, an entry point into a larger conversation about how nations are built, how they fracture, and how people, flawed and striving, shape the world they will never fully live to see. In classrooms, young minds began to ask different questions, not just who was Hamilton, but why did he matter then, and why does he still matter now? These weren't just history lessons, they were lessons in identity, ambition, conflict and compromise. Teachers no longer spoke of him as a dry name in a list. They told his story. How a boy, born into obscurity in the Caribbean, orphaned before his teens, found power in literacy and language. How he transformed from clerk to soldier, from aide-de-camp to statesman. And how he built the systems that would endure long after his life was cut short by one pull of a trigger. They discussed the contradictions. How the same man who rose from poverty crafted a financial system some said favored the wealthy. How the author of some of America's greatest arguments for justice participated, however quietly, in systems that excluded others. How his intense belief in order sometimes made him distrust freedom's untidy edges. And yet, through every contradiction, there was motion, a relentless desire to build, to reform, to prove that where you begin does not define where you end. As these stories found new ears, Hamilton began to appear in places that once overlooked him. Public libraries hosted Hamilton-themed community nights. Law schools offered seminars not just on his legal legacy, but on his vision of federal power and constitutional interpretation. Economists revisited his banking proposals, seeing in them the DNA of modern central finance. Political scientists explored how his belief in a strong, centralized union was tested again and again, through civil war, through depression, through the fragile balancing acts of the 20th century. Even urban planners looked at his early promotion of manufacturing, trade, and infrastructure and saw in him a precursor to the modern city, the idea that a nation's greatness is built not just on land, but on networks. But there was something else too, something quieter. In personal essays, in book clubs, in social media threads, people began to reflect not on Hamilton the politician, but Hamilton the human. The young man who wrote so eloquently about the hurricane that devastated his island home. The heartbroken father who watched his son die in a duel he had tried to prevent. The husband who strayed, confessed, and then lived with the fallout not only in headlines, but in the eyes of the woman he loved. These were not just facts. They were emotional truths. They made him relatable in a way that marble never could. And Eliza, too, began to take her rightful place in this modern memory. The woman who, after losing everything, built an orphanage, preserved a legacy, gave her life not to bitterness, but to rebuilding. Through her, Hamilton's story remained rooted in something deeper than ambition. It became a story about what we do after loss, about how we carry on, about how love, when persistent and quiet, can become history's truest guardian. Museums updated their exhibits. The Hamilton Grange was restored and reinterpreted with richer detail. Visitors were no longer merely told what Hamilton did. They were invited to imagine why he did it, how it felt, what it cost him. And there, too, the question of legacy was never far, because Hamilton had lived with legacy as a constant companion. From the moment he began writing, he seemed to understand that words could outlast life, that paper, if protected, could become permanence. But legacy, as the world would come to understand, is never just about being remembered. It's about what others do with your memory. And Hamilton's legacy, for all its complexity, began to serve a deeper role, not as a template, but as a touchstone. A reminder that the founding of anything, a country, a movement, a life of purpose, is never clean. It is made in drafts, in revisions, in conflict. It is made by people who are not perfect, but who try. And Hamilton tried, even when misunderstood, even when outnumbered, even when falling. He tried to build something larger than himself, and in doing so, he joined the long, invisible line of people who dare to shape the future, knowing they will never stand in it. So tonight, as the darkness folds softly around you, let that image settle. A single candle still burning in a small room, a desk scattered with drafts and scribbled notes, a man, tired but focused, writing into the night. He does not know what the world will become, but he knows what he must try to leave behind. He writes not to be famous, he writes to be useful. And through those words, his hand, long gone, still reaches forward, to us, to now, to what we choose to remember. In the gentle stillness of the world just before dawn, when the city is not yet awake but no longer fully asleep, that is when Hamilton would have been writing. Before the birds, before the newsboys, before the streets filled with boots and wheels. Just him, a candle stub, and the scratch of a quill on parchment. He lived in the margins of time, working when others rested, thinking when others turned away. It wasn't just ambition that drove him. It was need. An urgency born from the knowledge that time was not promised. That opportunity, once missed, might never return. That legacy, if not recorded, could vanish. He had learned that early, in the shadows of the Caribbean, where poverty and scandal shaped the edges of his childhood, where he read books not for school, but for survival, where he saw ships come and go and understood instinctively that movement was the only path forward. Standing still meant being forgotten. And now, centuries later, that movement had carried him farther than even he could have imagined. Because Alexander Hamilton, long buried beneath the noise of louder names and simpler narratives, had quietly become one of the most enduring figures in the American story. Not because he won all his battles, he lost many. Not because he lived a long life, he died young. And not because he was always admired. He was not, but because he built. And builders, in the end, always leave something behind. It was not only the Treasury or the Coast Guard or the Bank of the United States. It was not only the debt system or the mint or the customs house. It was the idea that a nation could be shaped by design, not accident. That the scaffolding of a country mattered just as much as its slogans. That freedom needed framework. That liberty needed law. This belief ran through everything he touched. It ran through the Federalist Papers. Those astonishing essays, penned in a fever of intellect and persuasion, meant not just to defend the Constitution, but to explain it, to give it bones and breath. He wrote them like he was fighting a war with words, because in his mind he was. A war for structure, for endurance, for a government that could survive its own birth. It ran through his financial plans too. His reports were not dry policy documents. They were blueprints, thick with ambition and clarity. He saw a future economy not as a luxury, but as a necessity. He believed that a government which could not pay its debts could not keep its promises. And so he gave it credit. Literally, he laid the foundation, and then he paid the price. Because building invites opposition. Hamilton's life was filled with conflict. He made enemies easily and kept them longer than most. Jefferson, Madison, Burr. They saw in him not just a rival, but a threat. His intellect was sharp, and he did not dull it for comfort. His pen was precise, and he did not soften its edge for diplomacy. He could be arrogant, impatient, wounding. But beneath it all was belief. Belief that the American experiment, this fragile thing, barely begun, could survive and even thrive if it was anchored to principles that would outlive its founders. And it was this belief that kept him working, even when his influence waned, even when scandals broke, even after Washington stepped down. Even after personal tragedies gutted him, he kept going. Because Hamilton understood something that few did in his time, that memory, like institutions, must be built, must be defended, must be passed on. He understood that people forget, that stories warp, that names fade, and so he wrote and wrote and wrote. Even his final political acts were efforts to shape legacy, to speak his version of the truth before silence claimed him, the Reynolds pamphlet, the essays against Burr, the letters to friends and foes. He was not always right, but he was always writing. And long after his voice fell silent, his words remained. They sat quietly in libraries. They were quoted in courtrooms. They were taught in schools even when his name was not. And they waited. Waited for a moment, a century later, when the world would finally read them again, not as relics, but as revelations. Now, as your breath slows and the edges of sleep draw near, imagine him once more. At his desk, the window cracked just slightly open to let in the breeze from the harbour. The city behind him still dark, his hand moving steadily, his face lit only by flame. He is tired. He is older now. But the words keep coming, because someone must record the moment. Someone must shape the memory. Someone must believe that the future begins not with fireworks or fanfare, but with ink. Sleep now. The pen is still moving. There is a certain kind of quiet that surrounds the end of a life like Alexander Hamilton's, not the silence of absence, but the softer hum of legacy settling into place. It's not loud. It doesn't demand. It waits. Because time, unlike politics, is patient. And it is only with time that we begin to see what someone truly left behind. Hamilton did not live to see the full reach of his influence. He died before America had fully become America, before it spanned oceans with steel, before it shaped global policy, before it wrestled with the consequences of its founding contradictions. He never saw the Civil War, never saw Reconstruction, never witnessed the tides of immigration that would reshape the identity of the very nation he helped imagine. And yet, somehow, he was in all of it. In every debate over federal versus state power. In every budget balanced or broken by Congress. In every courtroom where a judge must interpret not only the letter of the Constitution, but its spirit. Hamilton had embedded himself not just in the structure of government, but in its ongoing story. Because what he created wasn't a monument. It was a mechanism. He believed in machinery, the machinery of government, of law, of finance. But beneath that machinery was always a deeper idea, that we could design a system strong enough to last, but flexible enough to grow. That we could write rules which protected freedom rather than restricted it. That a nation could be engineered, not with bloodlines or crowns, but with documents and debate. That belief is more radical than it seems, because it rests not on faith in men, but on faith in systems. And systems, when built well, do not vanish when their creators are gone. But systems are not eternal on their own. They must be maintained, understood, tended to. And that's why Hamilton's words never stopped being read. They became guides. For Lincoln, they were structure. For Roosevelt, they were inspiration. For modern jurists, they remain grounding. For everyday citizens trying to understand the why behind the what, Hamilton is the voice that says, "Here, let me show you how this was meant to work." He was not always right, he was not always kind, but he was always deliberate. Even in his personal life, you can see this. In the way he mentored younger men. In the way he tried to prepare his children for a world that he knew would not always be just. In the way he turned to Eliza, again and again, not only for comfort, but for truth. He needed her steady gaze when the world around him blurred with ambition and rage, and she gave it to him. Even in the end. After the duel, after the bullet, after the long hours of pain in that final borrowed bed, it was Eliza who held his hand. It was Eliza who listened to his apologies, his final wishes. It was Eliza who heard his voice fade. And it was Eliza who stood, alone but unyielding, in the space where he had once stood, facing the world not with arguments, but with endurance. She lived another 50 years, half a century of remembering, half a century of telling his story, of correcting the rumors, of collecting his letters and shaping his legacy with careful hands and a patient heart. If Hamilton built the foundation, Eliza tended the flame. Together, though history so often forgets it, they created something larger than both of them, something that survived. And that survival is its own kind of triumph. Because Hamilton, more than anything, feared being forgotten. His writing, his policies, his urgency, so much of it came from the belief that life was short and meaning had to be carved into stone before time could wash it away. But he was not forgotten, not by Eliza, not by history, not by us. Now as you lie quietly, eyes closed, drifting into sleep, imagine him again, not at war, not in a duel, not on a stage, but at peace. Perhaps sitting by a window in the home he loved, listening to the voices of his children in the next room. Perhaps holding Eliza's hand, her presence a calm after every storm. Perhaps walking alone through the streets of New York, not as a politician, but as a man who had risen from nothing, a man who had dared to design a nation, a man who even now is still with us, in words, in systems, in story. Sleep now. He is not done speaking, only resting. In the shadowed corners of American memory, where myth and man often blur, Alexander Hamilton remains, watchful, unresolved, still whispering through the seams of the country he helped stitch together. Not as a ghost haunting history, but as a presence embedded deep in the frame of it, like beams behind walls, silent but necessary. The legacy of Hamilton was never meant to be finished. He didn't leave a polished conclusion. He left a challenge, an invitation. A question written in the margins of his work, in the urgency of his letters, in the relentlessness of his motion. What will you build? For Hamilton, building was never optional. It was the condition of survival. As a boy abandoned and ashamed, he understood something about the world that many spend lifetimes avoiding, that no one was coming to save him. That if he wanted to matter, if he wanted to live beyond the day, he would have to create something bigger than himself. And he did. But creation, at its core, is a lonely act. Hamilton often found himself isolated even when surrounded. His mind moved faster than most, his passions burned hotter, and that friction between speed and stillness, between brilliance and belonging, marked his every step. Friends admired him, enemies feared him, colleagues misunderstood him. And only a few, like Eliza and Washington, ever truly saw the full shape of the man beneath the posture. It is tempting now to imagine him content, to picture him fulfilled in the last moments, knowing he had changed a nation. But Hamilton was never a man of stillness. Even in peace, he wrestled, with pride, with regret, with the unfinished chapters of his story. He wanted to live long enough to shape more, to guide his children, to revise the record, to finish the sentences history would later try to complete for him. But time does not always wait for men of vision. And so, he passed with things unsaid, plans unrealized, bridges uncrossed, yet even in incompletion he left tools. The structure of the Constitution made clearer by the Federalist Papers, the Treasury given muscle and method, the judiciary interpreted with precision, the nation's financial credibility salvaged from ruin. And these tools, passed hand to hand through generations, shaped the decisions of those who came after. They gave future leaders a foundation, not perfect, not sacred, but solid, real. His legacy was not to command history, but to empower those who would. And what a legacy it became. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, Hamilton's systems endured wars, depressions, assassinations, scandals and recoveries. His essays remained required reading. His ideas echoed through budgets, bank halls and courtrooms. His name, once tangled in scandal, now stood carved in stone, etched into currency, and, more recently, etched into song. But there was something more, something deeper. Something about Hamilton spoke to the strivers, the outsiders, the people who came from nowhere and dreamed of somewhere, the immigrants, the underdogs, the writers, the ones who believed that if they worked hard enough, if they thought deeply enough, if they crafted with enough care, they too might shape something that lasted. Hamilton gave them a blueprint not just for government, but for grit. He showed what it meant to write your way into the world, to carry pain and still produce purpose, to love fiercely even when you feared loss, to speak even when no one was listening, because the words might echo one day. And now, in the soft hush of your own evening, that echo is here again. It hums not from textbooks or theatre stages tonight, but from something more intimate. The quiet understanding that history is not just names and dates, but choices. And Hamilton made choices with full fire, knowing they might cost him everything. Sometimes they did, but even then he pressed forward, because to him the most dangerous thing was not failure. It was silence. And so he kept speaking, kept writing, kept building, and when he could no longer go on, others picked up the pen. Eliza, his children, historians, artists, you. As sleep begins to wrap around you like a calm harbour, imagine Hamilton again. Not the towering figure of Broadway or the stern face on a bill, but the young man beneath it all. The boy with the books, the orphan with the storm in his heart, the soldier with the pen in his hand. Looking ahead, always ahead, to a world he would never fully see. But he believed it could be better, and he built for it anyway. Now rest, knowing he's still building, in every story remembered, in every lesson passed on, in every voice that chooses once again to speak. In the deep folds of nighttime, where memories drift like ships across dark water, Alexander Hamilton's legacy continues to glide quietly forward, not driven by sails of glory, but by the steady wind of consequence. There are figures in history who live loud and burn quickly, whose fame fades like smoke. But Hamilton was made of denser matter. His story does not vanish, it settles, and it settles in places not always visible. In the fine print of a banking regulation, in the opening arguments of a federal trial, in the structure of a congressional budget bill, in the rhythm of young students reciting the preamble of the Constitution, in the rising of skyscrapers over once silent harbours. He is there, not as a ghost, but as a presence in the seams of it all. Because for all his fire, for all his drama, for all the myths and scandals and duels that defined the edges of his life, Hamilton's true legacy is not in the spectacle, it's in the structure. The way he thought, the way he planned, the way he saw a nation not just as a dream, but as a design. To him, the Republic was not something sacred and untouched. It was something alive, something to be built, maintained, argued over, repaired, something worth the fight. And fight he did. In his own time, he was constantly on the defensive, constantly writing, rebutting, redefining, misunderstood by many, mischaracterized by others, always defending himself, always explaining, always trying to catch up to the story being told about him by men who spoke louder, who lived longer, who had fewer mistakes to account for. He never got to tell the final version of his story, but others would. His son, John Church Hamilton, laboured for decades to gather his father's writings, to polish his reputation, to offer him to history not as a tragic figure, but as a foundational one. Eliza had kept the flame alive. John tried to turn it into a beacon, and though his efforts were not always immediate in their effect, they mattered. They preserved the documents that would one day allow future scholars and artists to meet Alexander not as a caricature, but as a man. That's the irony of legacy. You cannot control it. You can only plant it, water it, hope for rain. Hamilton, who feared being forgotten, was not. But it took time. It took patience. And it took a changing world to finally see what he had tried to show all along. That ideas, when put into structure, can outlive violence. That vision, when wrapped in discipline, can bend time. That love for country, for family, for meaning is not always tidy, but can still be lasting. He was not without fault. He failed often. He hurt those he loved. He let pride guide him into dark places. He broke things. He broke people. But he also built. He built. And he believed, sometimes wildly, sometimes arrogantly, sometimes desperately, that the act of building was sacred. This, perhaps, is why Hamilton endures. Not as a saint, not as a savior, but as something more relatable. A flawed human being who didn't wait for the world to give him a place, but carved one out with words and will. As the country continued into the 21st century, facing challenges he could never have imagined, reckoning with truths he only glimpsed, the resonance of his voice grew clearer. His questions became ours, his worries familiar, his convictions challenged and reconsidered. And that process of remembering, revisiting, reframing became part of his ongoing life. Because history is not fixed. It is not a museum. It is a dialogue. And Hamilton, with his relentless pen and his brilliant contradictions, remains part of that conversation. He asks us still, what kind of country do you want to live in? What are you willing to risk to build it? Who will tell your story when you're gone? And what, if anything, will last? Tonight, let those questions drift softly through your mind as sleep takes hold, not as burdens, but as invitations. Imagine Hamilton once more, leaning over a desk in candlelight, the edges of his coat rumpled, his eyes tired but alive, a letter half finished, a new idea forming, a mind that could not rest, not yet. He pauses, he dips the pen, he writes again, and somewhere, somehow, the world turns a little more surely because of it. Sleep now. The builder is still at work. The story of Alexander Hamilton has always been about what lies beneath the surface, beneath the polished marble of monuments, beneath the $10 bill, beneath the fiery letters and formal portraits. Beneath all of it, there is a pulse, a steady, restless rhythm, not of a perfect man, but of a determined one. A man who lived as though time were chasing him, and who built as though the future depended on every brick. Because for Hamilton, it did. He understood what so few at the time were willing to say aloud, that this country was not inevitable, that the Union was not guaranteed, that the values spoken so boldly in declarations could rot from within without structure to hold them in place. He knew fragility. He had lived it. In the colonial Caribbean, he had seen firsthand what happened when systems collapsed, when power was abused, when people were left to fate. He had been abandoned, left fatherless, penniless, and marked by illegitimacy. And out of that pain, he made a vow not to escape the world's cruelty, but to outdesign it. Every plan he crafted, every financial blueprint, every Federalist essay, every constitutional argument was his way of holding chaos at bay. Not for himself, for the country, for the future. He feared disorder, not because he was afraid of change, but because he knew what happened when nations had nothing to stand on. And so he built. When he designed the National Bank, he wasn't just creating a repository for federal funds. He was asserting that America would be creditworthy, disciplined, and stable. That this experiment would not crumble under its debts, that the new republic would be respected abroad. When he defended the Constitution, he wasn't simply siding with strong government. He was protecting the fragile threads that held 13 discordant states together. He knew that unity was not a given. It was a task, a project, a tension to be managed, not a fact to be assumed. Even his often criticized belief in executive authority stemmed not from authoritarian instincts, but from deep, sober fear that in the absence of clear leadership, democracy would drift into demagoguery or division. And though his tone was often sharp and his methods impatient, his motives were rooted in protection, of ideas, of people, of posterity. Yet for all his brilliance, Hamilton could not protect himself from the consequences of pride. That duel, forever etched in the national memory, was not an aberration. It was a tragic fulfillment of everything that had followed him from the start. The need to defend his honor, the refusal to be spoken for, the impossible standard he placed on his name, his reputation, his legacy. He had spent his life writing the terms of his own story, and in the end, He could not bear to let another man write the final line. And so he went, to the edge of the Hudson, to the trees above Weehawken, to the early morning mist, and he fell. But death did not quiet him, because the work remained, the words remained, and the questions he left behind are still being asked. How do you build a government that balances liberty with order? How do you shape an economy that serves both stability and opportunity? How do you lead a nation made up of people from everywhere, bound by ideas rather than ancestry? How do you, from nothing, create something that lasts? These were not abstract theories to Hamilton. They were personal, urgent, written in the marrow of his life. And in the centuries since his death, we have returned to them again and again, each generation reinterpreting, arguing, adjusting. He would have expected that, perhaps even hoped for it. Because he believed in dynamic systems, in the living nature of democracy, in progress made through debate, through structure, through effort. And he believed in legacy, not as vanity, but as continuity. He once wrote, "A nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one." He feared apathy more than defeat. He feared stagnation more than controversy. Because to him, the greatest betrayal of freedom was indifference. And so, even now, his voice is here. Underneath the noise, underneath the headlines, in the questions we ask about power, about fairness, about how to balance past with present. You may not hear it every day, but when you sit in a courtroom or file your taxes or vote in an election or read a dissenting opinion from the Supreme Court, you are living inside a world he helped imagine, a world that bears his fingerprints, faint but firm. And as sleep begins to take hold, you might picture him once more, his face not carved in stone but lit by candlelight, his hands stained with ink, his eyes tired but focused, still writing, still fighting, still believing, not in glory, but in the quiet, enduring work of shaping something that matters. So rest now. The systems are still holding. The questions are still being asked. And somewhere, deep in the heart of history, he is still answering. As dawn breaks across the imagined landscape of history, a landscape built from memory, from conflict, from compromise, the outline of Alexander Hamilton remains, not in shadow but in silhouette. There is a stillness to him now. Not the stillness of finality, but of endurance, the kind of quiet that belongs only to things built to last. You can feel him most clearly in the early hours, before cities come fully alive, when the hum of infrastructure begins to rise. Streetcars starting their morning runs, lights flickering on in courtrooms and banks, the day's first exchange of currency. The mechanisms he helped set in motion still turning, still ticking, long after his body returned to the earth beside Trinity Church. Yet for all the systems he gave us, it is his humanness that brings him close. He was perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, utterly and deeply human. Proud, sharp, passionate, petty, idealistic, flawed, and endlessly striving. He knew failure intimately and success never comfortably. He wore both like armor and sometimes like a burden. There is a reason his story continues to resonate in an age where stories are the currency of culture, because his was not one of inherited greatness, but of self-invention. He did not rise because of name or fortune. He rose because of words, because he used the language available to him, letters, essays, speeches, as a ladder, every paragraph a rung, every argument a reach upward. And with that ascent came danger. Hamilton lived as though he were running out of time. Perhaps he knew, even from youth, that he would not live long. There is something about the pace of his life that suggests this, a man burning the candle not at both ends but straight through the middle, always moving, always reaching, always writing. He had enemies, yes, he made them easily. But more than that, he challenged people not only to agree with him but to think, to consider the design beneath the ideal, the consequence beneath the creed. That made him invaluable to the building of a republic, but unbearable to many who served alongside him. Still he stayed. He stayed through scandal, through political exile, through personal grief. After Washington stepped down, Hamilton could have faded quietly, retired into law, into family, into peace. But he couldn't. His mind would not let him. His convictions would not allow it. So he continued. Behind the scenes, through private letters, through newspaper essays signed under pseudonyms, through late-night meetings and fevered drafts of policy, because he did not believe America was finished, not even close. And he was right. Hamilton understood, better than most, that the nation's survival was not a single moment of victory, but a constant negotiation between state and citizen, between freedom and order, between yesterday's promises and tomorrow's demands. He built not for his time, but for the tests he knew would come. And they came. They always do. They came during the Civil War, when his warnings about division proved prophetic. They came during financial panics, when his banking systems held or were missed. They came during global conflicts, when centralized power became the hinge of response. They came during moments of social reckoning, when Americans asked themselves whether the systems he helped create could bend without breaking, could stretch without snapping. And through each of those trials, Hamilton's presence was there, not always invoked by name, but felt in the institutional muscle memory of a nation. The question now is not whether we remember him, but how. Do we remember him as the combative genius of policy, the wounded, driven orphan of the islands, the architect of treasury, of credit, of law? Or do we remember him as all of it, whole, complicated human? The answer is up to us. And maybe that, too, is part of his legacy, that the story of America is not fixed. It is not one voice. It is many. And Hamilton, though he often tried to shout the loudest, understood the value of debate, of dissent, of revising the record. Even now, his story continues to evolve. Each retelling is not a replacement, but an addition. Each generation sees him through a new lens. Immigrant, patriot, elitist, reformer, lover, father, fighter. No version cancels the others. All of them live within the truth of a life spent building a country that, by design, was always meant to be unfinished. That was the point. That was the promise. And that is where we find him still, not standing on a pedestal, but walking among us, always a little ahead, always asking, what will you build? What will you leave? What story will they tell of you when you are gone? Now, as the night draws to its final stillness and the soft grey of morning begins to edge into view, let that question settle with you, not as a burden, but as a quiet invitation. The same one Hamilton once answered, again and again with pen in hand. Sleep now. The world he built is still turning, and the future, as ever, waits for someone to write the next line. And now, as our journey draws to its final chapter, we return once more to the quiet figure who has carried us through each hour of this long, unfolding night. A man born into nothing, who imagined everything, and left behind a legacy that still pulses through the veins of a nation. Alexander Hamilton. Not as a statue, not as a slogan, but as a story. The story of a child born out of wedlock on a wind-swept Caribbean island, standing alone beside the grave of a mother taken too soon. The story of a teenager who wrote of hurricanes and heartbreak with such beauty and urgency that strangers gathered their coins to send him away to possibility. The story of a young immigrant arriving in a divided land, ready not just to survive, but to shape. He rose not because the world welcomed him, but because he refused to stay silent. He became a soldier, a statesman, a strategist, a voice too sharp to ignore. He helped forge a constitution. He structured a nation's economy. He defended his ideas with paper, with steel, and sometimes with too much pride. He won wars of intellect and lost battles of ego. He loved fiercely, failed publicly, and carried grief as a constant companion. He gave his mind to the Republic and his heart to his family. And when his time ended, too early, too suddenly, he left a story that would sleep in the archives, waiting to be found again. And it was. We have found it. Page by page, letter by letter. We have read the words he once feared would disappear. We have watched the systems he designed hold firm through centuries of change. We have debated his intentions, questioned his contradictions, and perhaps most importantly, we have brought his voice into the present, not because it is perfect, but because it still speaks. He was flawed, and that is why we understand him. He was brilliant, and that is why we remember him. He was tireless, and that is why we feel him still. For in every child who dares to rise above circumstance, in every immigrant who believes they belong, in every writer who knows that words can shape the world, Hamilton lives again. In every debate about power and people, in every court ruling, every financial policy, every defense of law and liberty, in every question that begins with, what comes next? His presence is not bound to time. It is bound to purpose. And though his name will always carry with it a swirl of pride and pain, genius and misstep, ambition and exile, it will also carry something else, something quieter, something enduring, hope. Hope that structure can protect freedom, hope that thought can balance passion, hope that the future is built, not inherited, hope that one life, any life, can change the course of history, even if it begins in obscurity. So as this final hour fades into the stillness of morning, let your thoughts settle like dust across parchment. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the quiet tick of time. Let the weight of these words rest gently on your heart. You have walked with Hamilton from island shore to battlefield, from cabinet room to courtroom, from paper to pistol, from silence to song. And now, as he finally sleeps, so may you. He has told his story. He has passed the pen. And in the soft hush of your own life, you hold it now. The next line is yours.